Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab. Now, let's begin. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor hummed as Grant Ryan paced outside the pediatric ward. His hands, calloused from years of construction work, trembled slightly as he checked his phone again. No messages from Alicia. His wife had stopped answering his calls 3 hours ago. Inside the examination room, his 7-year-old son Ethan sat on the paper-covered table, his small frame barely making a dent. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying anymore, but from the exhaustion that follows a storm of tears. Grant had found him in his bedroom that evening, refusing to take off his sneakers despite the summer heat making their small house feel like an oven. "Dad, please no," Ethan had whispered when Grant reached for the laces. The fear in those words had cut through Grant like a blade. Dr. Patricia Gomez emerged from the room, her expression grave. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too much in her short career. "Mr. Ryan, I need to speak with you." Grant followed her to a small consultation room. The walls were covered with cheerful posters about hand washing and nutrition, a stark contrast to what he was about to hear. "The burns on Ethan's feet are second degree in several places," Dr. Gomez said, pulling up photos on her tablet. Grant felt his stomach turn. "They're consistent with contact burns from a heated surface." Based on the pattern in Ethan's description, someone pressed his bare feet against something extremely hot, likely a clothes iron or similar appliance. "His grandmother," Grant said, his voice hollow. "My mother-in-law, Marlene Stevenson. He told me she did it because he walked on her carpet." Dr. Gomez nodded slowly. "I'm required by law to report this to Child Protective Services and the police. This is severe abuse, Mr. Ryan. These wounds are going to take weeks to heal properly, and there's risk of infection." Grant's phone buzzed. Finally, Alicia. He answered immediately. "Where are you?" His wife's voice was sharp, annoyed rather than concerned. "Mom said you stormed out with Ethan and won't answer her calls." "Alicia, your mother burned our son's feet. We're at the hospital." Silence. "Then, what are you talking about?" "She took an iron or something hot and burned the soles of his feet because he walked on her precious carpet. There are blisters, Alicia. Open wounds. The doctor had to give him pain medication." "Grant, that's ridiculous. Mom would never." "I saw them. The doctor saw them. Ethan told me what happened." Another pause. "Well, what was he doing running around on her white carpet with dirty feet? You know how particular she is about her house. He needs to learn to follow rules." Grant felt something crack inside his chest. "Are you seriously defending this right now?" "I'm saying you're overreacting. Kids exaggerate. He probably burned himself playing around and blamed Grandma to avoid getting in trouble. He's 7 years old, Alicia." "Exactly. 7-year-olds lie." Her voice took on that familiar edge, the one that meant she was done with the conversation. "I'm at Mom and Dad's now. We're having dinner. You need to bring Ethan back and apologize for causing this drama." Grant looked through the window at Ethan, who sat swinging his bandaged feet carefully, avoiding touching the floor. A nurse was offering him a popsicle. "No," he said quietly. "Excuse me?" "I said no. I'm not bringing him back there. Not tonight. Not ever." "Grant, don't be ridiculous. Where are you going to go? Your apartment is rented out, remember? We sold it when we moved into Mom and Dad's rental property. That had been Alicia's idea 6 months ago. Her parents own a small house 3 streets away from their main residence. The rent was cheap, too cheap, Grant had thought at the time. But Alicia had been insistent. "It's a great opportunity," she'd said, "and Ethan can spend more time with his grandparents." Now he understood it had been a trap. "We'll figure out," Grant said, hanging up before she could respond. Dr. Gomez stepped closer. "Mr. Ryan, I know this is overwhelming. CPS will be here within the hour, and there's a police detective on the way. Given what you've told me and Ethan's statement, they'll likely advise you not to return to your current residence if the perpetrator has access. She lives 3 streets away. She has a key to our place. Then you'll need somewhere else to stay tonight. Do you have family?" Grant thought of his brother, Raymond, 6 hours north in Millbrook. They hadn't spoken in almost a year. Alicia had orchestrated distance between them after Raymond made pointed comments about the Stevenson family at Thanksgiving. "They're controlling, Grant," Raymond had warned. "And Alicia's too deep in it to see." Grant had chosen his wife over his brother. Now he wondered if that had been a mistake. "I have somewhere we can go," he told Dr. Gomez. 2 hours later, after speaking with CPS caseworker Joyce Martinez and Detective Philip Richmond from the county sheriff's office, Grant carried Ethan to their car. The boy was drowsy from pain medication, his feet wrapped in thick bandages and protective booties. "Where are we going, Dad?" Ethan mumbled against his shoulder. "Somewhere safe, buddy. Uncle Raymond's place." "Will Mom come?" Grant buckled him into the car's seat, his throat tight. "Not right now." As he drove away from the hospital, his phone exploded with messages. Alicia, furious. Marlene, claiming he was being dramatic. Wesley Stevenson, his father-in-law, threatening legal action for parental kidnapping. Grant silenced them all. The 6-hour drive north gave him time to think. The highway was mostly empty at midnight, stretches of darkness broken by the occasional truck stop or small town. Ethan slept in the back seat, exhausted. Grant's mind churned through the past 6 months. The move to the Stevenson rental had changed things. Marlene had inserted herself into their lives completely, showing up unannounced, demanding Ethan come over for visits, criticizing Alicia's parenting in ways that made his wife defensive and cruel to compensate. Grant had worked long hours, coming home tired, not noticing how thin Ethan had become, how quiet. There had been other incidents he realized now. Ethan falling down the stairs at Marlene's house, getting a black eye. "He's clumsy," Marlene had said. Alicia agreed. The time Ethan had a bruise on his arm, shaped like fingers. "He bruises easily," Alicia had dismissed when Grant questioned it. He'd been blind. Or maybe he'd been blinded, deliberately isolated from his son to miss the warning signs. His phone rang. "Raymond." "Grant?" "Man, it's midnight. Everything okay?" Grant's voice cracked. "Ray, I need help. I'm about 3 hours out. Can I bring Ethan and stay with you for a few days?" "Of course." "What happened?" Grant told him. Everything. As he spoke, Raymond's breathing grew heavier on the other end. "Jesus Christ," Raymond finally said. "Alicia's defending them. She's at their house right now, probably planning how to get Ethan back. They won't. I'll make sure of it. Drive safe, brother. We'll figure this out when you get here." Grant felt something loosen in his chest. He wasn't alone. The landscape changed as he drove north, from flat farmland to rolling hills dotted with forest. Millbrook was a small town where Raymond worked as a civil engineer for the county. He'd moved there after his divorce, wanting a fresh start. Grant hadn't visited even once. Alicia had always found reasons why they couldn't make the trip. He pulled into Raymond's driveway at 3:47 a.m. His brother was waiting on the porch, a tall figure backlit by the porch light. Raymond had their father's build, broad shoulders, strong jaw. Grant had always been the smaller brother, wiry and compact. "Let me help you with him," Raymond said, opening the back door carefully. Together, they carried Ethan inside to a guest room Raymond had already prepared with fresh sheets and extra pillows. "Coffee," Raymond offered once Ethan was settled. They sat at the kitchen table, both exhausted. Raymond was 42, for years older than Grant, with gray threading through his dark hair. He looked at his younger brother with concern. "You did the right thing," Raymond said. "Get him out of there. Alicia's going to fight me on this." "Let her. You have a doctor's report, photos, witnesses. CPS is involved." The detective said he'd be opening an investigation, right? Grant nodded. "Detective Richmond." He seemed interested, like this wasn't just routine for him. "What do you mean?" When I mentioned the Stevensons by name, he reacted, asked me to repeat their address. Then he made a phone call before he finished taking my statement. Raymond leaned forward. "That's odd. He told me not to go back to the house. Said to stay somewhere they couldn't find me for at least 72 hours while they investigated." He was very specific about the time frame. Maybe they're planning a search warrant for a child abuse case? That seems like overkill. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching the sky. "Grant," Raymond said carefully, "there's something I never told you about Thanksgiving last year. About why I said what I said about the Stevensons." "What?" "After dinner, when you and Alicia were putting Ethan to bed, I went out for a smoke. Wesley followed me outside. He'd had a few drinks, was getting chatty. He started telling me about their old neighborhood before they moved to your area. So they'd lived in a place called Ashford Heights for almost 20 years. Okay. He said they had to leave because people were asking too many questions. Then he laughed it off, said he was kidding. But Grant, it didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like a warning, like he was testing me to see if I'd ask more. Grant felt cold. What kind of questions? He didn't say, but I looked them up afterward. There's almost nothing online about Wesley or Marlene Stevenson before 15 years ago. No social media history, no property records before they bought their current house. It's like they appeared out of nowhere. People could be private, not that private. Everyone leaves a digital footprint. I found one news article from Ashford Heights, dated 16 years ago, about a missing child, a 10-year-old girl who disappeared from her grandmother's house during a family visit. The kitchen suddenly felt very cold. What was the grandmother's name? Grant asked, though he already knew. Raymond met his eyes. The article didn't say. But Grant, the timing matches. And Wesley's slip about leaving because of questions. What if there's a reason Marlene is the way she is with Ethan? What if he's not the first? Grant stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. His mind raced through possibilities, each more horrible than the last. Detective Richmond's phone call, he said slowly. He recognized their names. You need to tell him I just told you. About Ashford Heights and the missing girl. Grant pulled out his phone and found the detective's card. It was almost 5 a.m., but Richmond had said a call if he remembered anything else. The detective answered on the second ring, sounding wide awake. Mr. Ryan, are you and your son somewhere safe? Where are my brothers? 6 hours away, like you suggested. Good. What's wrong? My brother just told me something about my in-laws, about their past before they moved to our area. He mentioned a missing child case in Ashford Heights 16 years ago. A long pause. Then, Mr. Ryan, I'm going to need you to come into the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office tomorrow morning. Not tonight. You and your son need rest. But tomorrow, 9 a.m. Ask for me specifically. And, Mr. Ryan, don't contact the Stevensons or your wife until after we talk. This is important. Why? What's going on? I can't discuss an ongoing investigation over the phone. But I will tell you this. You may have just saved your son's life. I'll see you at 9. The line went dead. Grant stared at his phone, his heart hammering. Raymond stood and put a hand on his shoulder. Whatever this is, Raymond said, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore. Grant nodded, unable to speak. In the guest room, Ethan slept peacefully, safe for the first time in months. Grant had driven 6 hours on instinct, on a father's desperate need to protect his child. Now he realized he might have driven them both away from something far worse than he'd imagined. Grant woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of bacon. For a moment, he was disoriented. Then the previous night came rushing back. He checked his phone, 7:43 a.m., and 37 missed calls. Most from Alicia. Several from numbers he didn't recognize. And one voicemail from his wife that he forced himself to listen to. Grant, this is insane. You've kidnapped our son. Mom's hysterical. She says she barely touched Ethan, that he's making up stories because he's mad about getting in trouble. Dad's calling his lawyer. If you don't bring Ethan home by tonight, we're filing a police report. I'm serious. You're going to destroy this family over nothing. He deleted it. In the kitchen, Raymond was making breakfast while Ethan sat at the table, working on a coloring book. His feet were propped on a chair, still bandaged. Morning, Dad, Ethan said quietly. The boy seemed different here, less anxious though still subdued. How are you feeling, buddy? It hurts less. Uncle Ray says we can watch movies today. We have to go somewhere first. But then movies sound great. After breakfast, Grant called his foreman to explain he needed emergency family leave. Then he got Ethan dressed carefully, avoiding pressure on his feet, and they drove to the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office. Detective Richmond was waiting in the lobby, a compact man in his 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. With him was a woman in her late 30s wearing a blazer and FBI credentials. Mr. Ryan, this is Special Agent Catherine Bridges. She's with the FBI's Child Exploitation and Human Trafficking Task Force. Grant's blood ran cold. Trafficking? Let's talk in private, Agent Bridges said, her voice gentle but firm. She looked down at Ethan with a kind smile. Hi, sweetheart. Is it okay if you hang out with Deputy Chun while your dad talks to us? She is coloring books and snacks. A young Asian woman in uniform appeared, crouching to Ethan's level. I also have a Nintendo Switch in my office. You like Mario Kart? Ethan's eyes lit up slightly, and he nodded. Grant watched his son walk carefully with the deputy, then followed Richmond and Bridges into a conference room. Before you panic, Bridges said once the door closed, we don't believe the Stevensons were involved in trafficking in the traditional sense. But when Detective Richmond called me last night about your situation and mentioned the Ashford Heights connection, I pulled a cold case file I've been working on for 2 years. She opened a laptop and turned it toward Grant. On the screen was a photo of a smiling girl with dark curls and a gap-toothed grin. Maya Shepard, age 10, disappeared from Ashford Heights 15 years ago during a weekend visit with her maternal grandmother. Grant stared at the photo, his stomach churning. What happened to her? That's what we never figured out. Maya's mother, Jeannie Shepard, had recently divorced and was working 2 jobs. The grandmother, Marlene Stevenson, though she was using her maiden name Conley at the time, offered to take Maya for weekends to help out. Wait, Grant interrupted. Marlene Conley? She reverted to her maiden name after a legal name change 14 years ago. Wesley did the same, adopting his mother's maiden name. They essentially erased their old identities. Richmond pulled out a thick file. Maya was reported missing on a Sunday evening when Jeannie came to pick her up. Marlene claimed Maya had gone to play in the woods behind her house and never came back. Search parties, dogs, helicopters, nothing. The girl vanished. Did they suspect Marlene? Everyone suspected Marlene, Bridges said. Neighbors reported hearing a child crying and screaming from her house on multiple occasions. The grandmother had a reputation for being severely strict, borderline abusive. But there was no evidence, no body, no witnesses, no forensic proof of foul play in the house. Because they probably cleaned it thoroughly, Grant said, his voice hollow. Exactly. The case went cold. Jeannie Shepard died 3 years later. Suicide. The community blamed Marlene, even though charges were never filed. The Stevensons moved away 6 months after Maya's disappearance. They bought property in your area under their new names and essentially started over. Grant felt sick, and no one connected them to the case. Name changes are legal. They didn't have criminal records. Unless someone was specifically looking for them, they'd have no reason to be on anyone's radar. Bridges leaned forward. Until yesterday, when your son gave a detailed account of abuse that matched witness statements from neighbors in Ashford Heights. Burns, bruises, a grandmother with an obsessive need for control and perfection. You think Marlene killed Maya. I think something happened to that little girl in Marlene's care. And I think your son might have been experiencing the same escalating pattern of abuse. Richmond opened another folder. We executed a search warrant on the Stevenson property this morning. Found something in the basement. A locked room that Wesley claimed was just storage. He showed Grant photos on his phone. The room had been finished carefully. Soundproofed walls, a reinforced door, a small cot bolted to the floor. Child-size restraints hung from one wall. In the corner was a box of medical supplies and something that made Grant's stomach turn. A collection of children's shoes, small sizes, meticulously labeled and dated. There are 12 pairs, Bridges said quietly. We're running them for DNA and missing persons databases. But Grant, one pair matches the description of shoes Maya Shepard was wearing the day she disappeared. The room spun. 12. We don't know if all of them belonged to victims or if Marlene was collecting them for other reasons. But we're treating this as a multiple homicide investigation now. Where are they? Grant managed. The Stevensons? In custody. Arrested this morning when we found the room. They're not getting bail. And Alicia? Richmond and Bridges exchanged a look. Your wife was at the house when we executed the warrant, Richmond said carefully. She became hysterical when we started searching the basement. Kept screaming that we had no right, that we were destroying her family. Wesley told her to shut up. That's when she said something interesting. What? She said, I did what you told me. I kept him quiet, just like before. Richmond leaned back in his chair. Mr. Ryan, How much time did your wife spend at her parents' house as a child? The implication hit Grant like a freight train. You think she knew? About Maya. About all of it. We think she might have witnessed something, yes. And we think her parents may have used that knowledge to control her, to make her complicit in hiding what they'd done. She was 19 when Maya disappeared, legally an adult. Grant put his head in his hands. His wife. The woman he'd loved for 8 years, the mother of his son. Did she know what they were doing to Ethan? That's what we're trying to determine. She's being questioned now. But Mr. Ryan, based on her phone calls to you and her statements this morning, we believe she was aware of at least some of the abuse and chose to enable it. Why? Grant looked up, his eyes burning. Why would she let them hurt our son? Bridges spoke softly. Sometimes victims of trauma become perpetrators themselves, or they align with abusers as a survival mechanism. Your wife grew up in that house with those parents. Whatever they did to her, or made her witness, it shaped her into someone who could rationalize abuse. It's not an excuse, it's just an explanation. I want full custody, Grant said, his voice hard. Whatever it takes. Alicia doesn't get near Ethan again. Given the circumstances, CPS will support that, Richmond assured him, especially with her parents facing multiple felony charges. But Grant, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Once the media gets hold of this story, once we identify those other children, it's going to be a circus. I don't care. I just want my son safe. Agent Bridges closed her laptop. He is safe. And you saved him. If you hadn't gotten him out of there when you did, if you'd believed your wife and taken him back. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They spent another hour going over statements, filling out paperwork, discussing the legal proceedings ahead. When Grant finally collected Ethan from Deputy Chen's office, his son was laughing at something on the switch screen, his cheeks flushed with genuine joy. Did I win? Ethan asked, looking up at his father. Yeah, buddy, Grant said, his throat tight. You won. As they drove back to Raymond's house, Grant's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He pulled over to read it. This is Joyce Martinez from CPS. Detective Richmond gave me your number. We need to schedule a home visit for wherever you're staying, but I wanted you to know, based on the evidence found today and Ethan's medical reports, we're recommending emergency termination of your wife's parental rights. The DA is also considering criminal charges against her for child endangerment and conspiracy. You're doing everything right. Keep your son close. Grant sat in the car, watching Ethan play a game on his tablet in the back seat, oblivious to how close he'd come to becoming another pair of shoes in a basement. Another missing child poster on a wall. Another cold case file. But he wasn't. He was alive, safe, laughing. Grant started the car and drove home to his brother's house, where he could start planning their next move. Because this wasn't over. The Stevensons would face justice in court, but there was something else Grant needed, something the legal system couldn't give him. He needed them to understand what they'd taken from him, from Ethan, from all those other children. He needed them to feel the same fear, the same helplessness. And Grant Ryan, patient and methodical, was very good at building things. He'd just have to learn how to destroy them instead. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and slow healing. Ethan started therapy with Dr. Lena Herring, a child psychologist in Millbrook who specialized in trauma. Grant attended every session, learning how to help his son process what had happened without letting it define him. The national news picked up the story after Agent Bridges and her team identified 6 of the 12 pairs of shoes. 6 children, all between ages 7 and 11, who had disappeared over a 20-year span from different states. All had been in the care of Marlene Stevenson, or Marlene Conley, or whatever other name she'd used at the time of their disappearance. Maya Shepard's shoes were positively identified through DNA found in the leather. So were those belonging to a boy named Timothy Nelson from Ohio, who'd vanished 12 years ago during a summer visit with his grandmother. The other 4 victims remained unidentified, but forensic genealogy teams were working on it. The basement room had given up more secrets. Behind a false wall, cadaver dogs alerted to areas where soil samples tested positive for human decomposition. The Stevensons weren't talking, but the evidence was damning. Wesley had built that room specifically for his wife's purposes. They'd been a team. Alicia, after 3 days of interrogation, finally broke. Her lawyer negotiated a plea deal in exchange for testimony. She told investigators about the summer she was 13, when her parents had fostered a girl named Clara for 6 weeks. Clara had run away, according to Marlene. But Alicia had heard the screaming stop that night, had seen her father carry something wrapped in a tarp to his truck, had never asked questions because her mother had pulled her aside the next morning and said, very calmly, "If you ever tell anyone what you might have seen, we'll say you helped. You'll go to prison too. Do you understand?" Alicia had understood, and she'd spent the next 23 years trapped in that understanding, complicit in silence, warped by the secret she carried. When she'd had Ethan, she'd hoped things would be different. But Marlene had wanted access to her grandson, and Wesley had reminded Alicia of what they knew about her. So she'd served up her own son to keep her parents quiet. Grant read the transcripts of her confession alone in Raymond's garage, where he'd been spending his evenings working on a project. When he finished, he set the papers aside and picked up his wrench. The plea deal would give Alicia 8 years for child endangerment and conspiracy after the fact. Wesley and Marlene would face trial for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and child abuse. They were looking at life without parole. But that wasn't enough for Grant. He'd spent the weeks since learning the truth researching everything he could about the Stevensons. Their assets, their connections, their secrets. Wesley had been a contractor like Grant. He understood how to build things, how to hide things. He'd been smart, careful, but Grant was smarter. The property in Ashford Heights, the original house where Maya had disappeared, was still owned by a shell company Wesley had created. It had been vacant for 15 years, maintained but never sold or rented. Grant had driven out there one weekend while Ethan was with Raymond and Dr. Herring. The house was exactly what he'd expected, a perfect suburban exterior hiding something rotten inside. He'd walked the property, noting the positions of the neighbors' houses, the sight lines, the basement access. In the backyard, near a shed, he'd found a patch of earth that looked different from the rest. New sod, maybe a few years old, covering something. Grant hadn't dug then, but he'd marked the spot on his phone's GPS. Now, sitting in Raymond's garage with the transcript of his wife's confession, he made a decision. The legal system would handle Wesley and Marlene's prosecution, but there were things the public didn't know yet, things that might never come out in court. Things Grant wanted to ensure were found. He pulled out his phone and called a number he'd been given by Agent Bridges, a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Marco Bauer who'd been consulting on the case. "Dr. Bauer? This is Grant Ryan. I think I know where you might find more remains." The excavation of the Ashford Heights property took 4 days. Grant stood at the police line, watching his teams in white suits carefully remove layer after layer of earth. Raymond stood beside him, a silent presence. On the 3rd day, they found her. Maya Shepherd, curled in what had once been a shallow grave in the backyard, now nearly 6 feet down because Wesley had added soil over the years to hide subsidence. Her remains were carefully documented, photographed, bagged, evidence that would seal the case against the Stevensons. But she wasn't alone. Beneath Maya, they found Timothy Nelson. And beneath him, wrapped in plastic and tarp, 3 more children who the database had identified as missing from different states, different families, different decades of Marlene's secret hobby of hurting children. The media coverage exploded. The Stevenson case became national news. True crime podcasts analyzed every detail, and Grant's phone rang constantly with interview requests he never answered. Instead, he focused on Ethan, who was making remarkable progress. The boy's feet had healed, leaving only faint scars. His nightmares were less frequent. He'd started smiling again, laughing at Raymond's terrible jokes, asking to call his father Dad instead of Daddy because he was getting too old for baby names. Grant had filed for divorce and full custody. Alicia's plea agreement included signing away her parental rights. She'd sent one letter from jail that Grant had burned without reading. Whatever she had to say, he didn't want to hear it, but there was still something nagging at him. The Stevensons had money. Wesley's contracting business had been successful, and they owned multiple properties. That money was now frozen, tied up in legal proceedings and victim restitution. But Grant knew Wesley. The man was a planner, a hoarder. He would have hidden assets somewhere. Grant started digging through public records, property assessments, business filings. He found 3 more shell companies registered in neighboring states, each on a property. Each property had been carefully maintained, but never used. He gave the information to Agent Bridges, who obtained warrants. The first property in Tennessee yielded nothing but empty rooms. The second, in Kentucky, had another soundproofed basement with evidence of use, restraint marks on the walls, stains that would test positive for blood, but no remains. The third property, in West Virginia, was different. Grant wasn't supposed to be there when they searched it. But Richmond had called him with an update, and Grant had driven 4 hours to see it with his own eyes. The house was isolated, set back from the road on 15 acres of forested land. Inside, it looked like a normal vacation cabin. Furniture, dishes, books on shelves. But in the master bedroom, they found a locked closet. Inside the closet was a safe. Wesley's lawyer had provided the combination as part of his attempt to negotiate a better sentence. Inside the safe were documents, birth certificates, social security cards, even passports for children who'd been reported missing decades ago. Wesley hadn't just helped Marlene kill. He'd been planning to traffic some of them, to sell them to others. But there was something else in the safe. A journal, handwritten in Marlene's neat script, detailing every child she'd harmed over 40 years. Some she'd fostered, some she'd babysat, some, like Maya and Ethan, had been family. The journal described her methods, her justifications, her feelings. It was a confession so complete, so damning, that the DA called Grant personally to say the Stevensons would never see daylight again. "We're pursuing federal charges now," the DA explained. "Multiple states, multiple victims. This is beyond anything I've seen in 30 years of prosecution. Mr. Ryan, I know this doesn't bring those children back, but I promise you, your in-laws will die in prison." Grant thanked him and hung up. He was standing in Raymond's backyard, watching Ethan kick a soccer ball with his cousin, Raymond's son from his first marriage, visiting for the week. The boys were laughing, racing normal. His phone rang again. Agent Bridges. "Grant, we just finished interviewing Marlene's sister, Donna Horton. She claimed she had no idea what her sister was doing, but she did give us something interesting. Apparently, Marlene inherited a property from their grandmother 20 years ago, a farm in rural Pennsylvania that the family stopped visiting in the 80s. We're getting a warrant. You think there's more? I think Marlene Stevenson has been doing this for a very long time, and I think she had places even Wesley didn't know about. Her sister mentioned that their grandmother was abusive, that Marlene learned her behaviors young. If that farm was where it started, find them," Grant said. "All of them. Every child deserves to be found. We will. And Grant, this case is only coming together because of you. Because you trusted your instincts and got your son out. Because you didn't stop pushing even when it would have been easier to accept the official story. You saved Ethan, and you're helping us save the memory of all these other children." After she hung up, Grant stood in the yard for a long time, watching his son play. The boy had survived because Grant had listened to his fear, had taken it seriously when everyone else dismissed it. But survival wasn't the same as justice. And justice through the legal system wasn't the same as the reckoning Grant wanted. He went inside and opened his laptop, pulling up the file he'd been building for weeks. A comprehensive dossier on every person who'd enabled the Stevensons over the years. The social workers who'd missed red flags. The foster care administrators who'd bent rules. The neighbors who'd heard screaming and done nothing. The family members who'd suspected and stayed silent. The legal system would handle Wesley and Marlene. But Grant was going to make sure everyone else who'd contributed to these tragedies faced consequences too. He started with Alicia's uncle, Frank Morse, who'd worked in child services and had personally approved several of the foster placements that put children in Marlene's care despite concerning background checks. Grant didn't know yet what form his reckoning would take, but he was patient. He had time, and he had a list. 6 months after Grant had driven away from the hospital with Ethan, he sat in a courtroom watching Wesley and Marlene Stevenson receive their sentences. The trial had been swift. Their lawyers had advised guilty pleas once the evidence became overwhelming. Now the judge was delivering the verdict. Marlene Stevenson, you are hereby sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole for the murders of Maya Shepard, Timothy Nelson, Clara Rodriguez, David Fisher, Sophie Bridges, Michael Caine, Angela Finley, and Emma Proctor. You will additionally serve 120 years for kidnapping, child abuse, and other crimes related to these cases and the abuse of your grandson, Ethan Ryan. Marlene stood perfectly still, her face blank. She'd maintained the same expression throughout the trial, showing no emotion even when confronted with evidence of her crimes. Only once had Grant seen her react, when the prosecution showed photos of the basement room. Her lips had twitched into something almost like a smile before she controlled it. Wesley Stevenson, you're sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without parole for your role in the murders of Maya Shepard, Timothy Nelson, Clara Rodriguez, David Fisher, Sophie Bridges, and Michael Caine, as well as conspiracy, kidnapping, child abuse, and destruction of evidence. You will also serve 100 years for related crimes. Wesley's face was red, angry. He tried to claim he'd been coerced by Marlene, that he was a victim too. The jury hadn't believed him. The evidence of his basement room, his meticulously kept records, his multiple properties designed for imprisonment and murder, it all pointed to an enthusiastic participant. As the bailiffs led them away, Marlene turned and looked directly at Grant. Her expression was still blank, but her eyes held a message. You think you've won, but you haven't. I got away with it for 40 years. I'd do it all again. Grant held her gaze until she was gone. Then he stood and walked out of the courtroom, where Ethan waited with Raymond and Dr. Herring. The boy ran to him immediately. Is it over, Dad? The trial part is, but there's still more to do. That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Grant sat down with Raymond in the garage. I need your help with something, Grant said. Anything. Frank Morse, Alicia's uncle. He's still working in child services. Still approving foster placements. Agent Bridges told me quietly that they've tried to investigate him, but he's protected by bureaucracy and union rules. Without direct evidence that he knew what Marlene was doing, they can't touch him. But you think he knew. I think he facilitated it. I think he got kickbacks or favors for sending troubled kids to Marlene's care, knowing they were vulnerable. I think he's responsible for at least 4 of those deaths. Raymond leaned back in his chair. What are you planning? I'm not planning to hurt him, if that's what you're asking. But I'm planning to make sure he can never do this again. And I'm planning to make sure everyone knows what he did. Over the next 3 months, Grant became someone he'd never thought he'd be. An investigator, a researcher, a hunter of truth. He pulled every foster care file Frank Morse had ever approved, cross-referenced them with Marlene's journal entries, and found the pattern. 15 children over 20 years, all placed with Marlene despite concerning evaluations, all during periods when Frank was the approving caseworker. He found financial records showing payments from Wesley shell companies to an LLC Frank owned. He found emails where Frank and Wesley discussed difficult placements and special cases. He compiled it all into a document 200 pages long, professionally bound, with an index and citations. He made 50 copies. Then he sent them. One went to the state attorney general's office. One to the state licensing board for social workers. One to the FBI. One to every major newspaper in the region. One to the director of child services for Frank's district. And one to Frank Morse's home address, with a note, your turn. Within a week, Frank Morse was suspended pending investigation. Within a month, he was indicted on federal charges of conspiracy and fraud. The licensing board revoked his credentials. The media coverage was brutal. Child services worker, enabled serial killer, read the headlines. Frank Morse would face his own trial, his own reckoning. Grant had made sure of it. But he wasn't done. There were 3 other names on his list. A doctor who'd treated several of the children and missed obvious signs of abuse. A teacher who'd been told by Maya Shepard that she was afraid of her grandmother and had done nothing. A neighbor in Ashford Heights who'd heard screaming dozens of times and never called the police. Grant visited each of them personally. The doctor, Patricia Manning, worked at a clinic in Ohio. Grant walked in her office during her lunch break, placed a folder on her desk, and said simply, Timothy Nelson told his mother he'd told you he was afraid. You wrote in his chart that he seemed anxious. You did nothing. I'm giving you 48 hours to retire and issue a public apology before I send this file to the medical board and every news outlet in the state. She'd gone pale, opened the folder, and seen copies of her own notes, Timothy's mother's statements, and a timeline showing she'd had 3 opportunities to report suspected abuse. I didn't know, she whispered. You suspected. That was enough. You had a duty to report. 2 days later, Dr. Manning announced her retirement and published an op-ed about the failures of medical professionals to identify abuse. Grant had written it for her, but she'd signed her name. The teacher, Donna Chun, was harder. She was younger, genuinely remorseful when Grant confronted her. I was 23, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was a first-year teacher. Maya told me she was scared of her grandmother, but when I mentioned it to the principal, he said family matters weren't our concern. I should have pushed harder. I should have called CPS myself. I think about it every day. Grant believed her, but that didn't absolve her. You're going to volunteer with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, he told her. Every weekend, every summer, for the rest of your career. You're going to speak at teacher training sessions about recognizing abuse. You're going to dedicate your life to making sure another teacher doesn't make your mistake. She agreed immediately, gratefully. Grant gave her Maya's photograph. Remember her. Remember what your silence cost. The neighbor in Ashford Heights, an elderly man named Roger Crosby, was defiant when Grant showed up at his door. What was I supposed to do? He demanded. Call the cops every time a kid makes noise? I minded my own business like decent people do. You heard screaming, Grant said, his voice calm. Multiple witnesses confirm you told them you heard a child screaming from Marlene's house, and you did nothing. So what? What are you going to do about it? I didn't break any laws. Grant pulled out his phone and played a recording. It was from a podcast episode about the case, where a former neighbor described hearing Maya's final screams and wondering why no one helped. The voice was disguised, but Grant had identified it as Roger's wife, now deceased. Your wife called the police 3 times, Grant said. Each time, she was told there wasn't enough evidence to investigate. Each time, you told her to stop making trouble. She told her sister before she died that she could never forgive herself for listening to you. That she heard Maya die and did nothing because her husband said it wasn't their problem. Roger's defiance crumbled. What do you want? I want you to live with it, Grant said simply. I want you to know that every person in this town knows what you heard and what you didn't do. I want you to see Maya's face every time you close your eyes. I'm not here to punish you. You're already punished. You're going to die knowing you could have saved a little girl and you chose comfort instead. He left the photograph on Roger's porch, Maya smiling, gap-toothed and innocent. As Grant drove away, he felt empty rather than satisfied. The people on his list were facing consequences, but it didn't bring anyone back. It didn't undo the trauma Ethan had suffered, or the deaths of 8 children, or the decades of evil that the Stevensons had perpetrated. But it was something. It was accountability in a world that often offered none. 1 year after the night Grant had driven his son to safety, Ethan blew out 8 candles on a birthday cake. They'd moved into their own place in Millbrook, a small house with a fenced yard where Raymond could visit easily. Grant had gotten a job with a local construction firm that offered better hours, letting him be present for Ethan after school. The therapy was ongoing. Ethan still had nightmares sometimes, still had moments where he flinched at loud noises. But he was healing. He made friends in his new school. He played soccer and laughed easily. He called Grant his hero, though Grant tried to tell him he'd only done what any father should do. You saved me, Ethan said seriously one night as Grant tucked him in. The other kids, they didn't have someone like you. Grant's throat tightened. They should have. Every child should have someone who protects them. That's what I want to be when I grow up, Ethan said. Someone who protects kids like you protected me. After his son was asleep, Grant sat on the porch with a beer, watching fireflies in the yard. His phone buzzed with an email from Agent Bridges. The Pennsylvania farm yielded 5 more remains, dating back to the 1970s. Marlene's grandmother was apparently just like her. The cycle of abuse went back at least 2 generations. We're still identifying victims, but Grant We're closing cases that have been cold for 50 years. Families are finally getting answers. I thought you'd want to know. 5 more. Generations of horror finally brought to light. Grant replied, "Thank you for telling me. Are there any more properties? We've searched everything we can find. But if you discover anything else, you know where to reach me. You've been invaluable to this investigation. The Bureau is considering a civilian commendation for your assistance." He didn't want a commendation. He just wanted to make sure it never happened again. His phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Ryan?" A woman's voice shaky. "My name is Joyce Chun. I was Donna Chen's sister. The teacher you spoke to. She wanted me to call you. She's been doing the volunteer work you asked for, and last week she identified signs of abuse in a foster child. She reported it immediately, and they removed the child from the home. The investigation found 2 other children being abused by the same foster parents. She wanted you to know. She said it doesn't make up for Maya, but she's going to keep trying." Grant closed his eyes. "Thank you for telling me. Tell your sister. Tell her Maya would be glad." After hanging up, he sat in the dark, processing. 1 child saved. Maybe more in the future. It wasn't vengeance exactly, but it was something better: transformation, redemption, change. His revenge against the people who'd enabled the Stevensons hadn't been violent or destructive. It had been calculated, strategic, designed to create lasting accountability. And it was working, but there was one more person who needed to face consequences. Someone Grant had been saving for last. Alicia was scheduled for release from jail in 7 years, having already served 1 year of her 8-year sentence. Her plea deal was generous, given her cooperation. But Grant had discovered something the prosecutors hadn't. Alicia had taken out a life insurance policy on Ethan 3 months before Marlene burned his feet. The policy was modest, $50,000, but the timing was suspicious, especially combined with a text message Shane Grant had found in old phone records. Alicia asking her mother, "How much longer until he learns?" And Marlene responding, "Patience. These things take time. Remember what happened with Maya when we rushed." Grant had given this information to the DA, who'd reopened Alicia's case. The plea deal was withdrawn. She faced new charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted insurance fraud. But Grant wanted her to understand something more than legal consequences. He wanted her to know what she'd lost. He wrote her a letter. Not angry or vengeful, but factual. "Alicia, Ethan turned 8 today. He learned to ride a bike last month without training wheels. He's reading at a 5th grade level. He told me yesterday he wants to be a social worker when he grows up, so he can help protect kids like he was protected. He doesn't ask about you anymore. Dr. Herring says that's healthy. He's processing his trauma by focusing on the people who are present and supportive. He calls Raymond Uncle Ray and talks about how cool it is to have family he can trust. I thought you'd want to know that the child you sold out to keep your parents' secret is thriving. He's everything you could never be. Kind, brave, honest. He's proof that trauma doesn't have to define you, that you can break cycles if you choose to. You made your choice. You chose your parents over your son. You chose silence over protection. You chose to be complicit in evil rather than risk exposure. I hope every day for the rest of your life, you think about what you could have had, what you could have been, what you threw away. Ethan will never read this letter. He doesn't need to, but I needed you to know you lost the only good thing you ever had, and you did it to yourself." Grant, he didn't send it immediately. He held on to it for a week, reading it again each night. Then, finally, he mailed it to the county jail where Alicia awaited her new trial. 2 weeks later, he received a response. Just 3 words in Alicia's handwriting. "I know. I'm sorry." Grant burned her letter without showing anyone. Her apology meant nothing. Sorry didn't fix the scars on Ethan's feet, didn't bring back the dead children, didn't undo the years of complicity. But it did confirm what Grant had suspected. She'd known all along. She'd chosen the evil she knew over the good she could have become. And that choice would define the rest of her life, just as Grant's choice to drive Ethan away that night had defined his. 2 years after the trial, Grant received an invitation to speak at a national conference on child protection and advocacy. Agent Bridges had nominated him, calling him a civilian who demonstrated extraordinary courage and investigative instincts that led to the resolution of multiple cold cases and the rescue of a child from ongoing abuse. He almost declined. Public speaking wasn't his strength, and he didn't want to be known as that guy from a Stevenson case. But Raymond convinced him. "You have a platform now," his brother said. "You can use it to make sure other kids have a chance. Other parents know they can trust their instincts even when everyone tells them they're wrong." So Grant went to the conference in Washington, D.C., bringing Ethan with him. He stood on a stage in front of 300 child welfare professionals and told his story. Not the sensational parts. The media had covered those to death. But the small moments. The way Ethan had whispered, "Please no," when Grant tried to remove his shoes. The dismissiveness of his wife's voice on the phone. The detective's careful questions that made Grant realize something bigger was happening. "I'm not a hero," he told the audience. "I'm just a father who listened to his child, who believed him when he said he was hurt, who chose to act even when it meant losing everything else, my wife, my home, my illusions about the people I trusted." He talked about the warning signs he'd missed, the ways he'd been isolated and controlled, the guilt he still carried about not seeing it sooner. "If you take one thing from my story," he concluded, "let it be this: believe children, even when it's inconvenient, even when it disrupts families or reputations or your own sense of how the world works. Believe them, because the alternative is 8 children buried in a backyard and one scarred survivor who only made it out because someone finally listened." The applause was thunderous, but Grant barely heard it. He was watching Ethan in the front row, his son giving him a thumbs up. After the speech, dozens of people approached Grant. Social workers, teachers, police officers, all thanking him, sharing their own stories of missed signs or successful interventions. One woman, an FBI agent named Olivia Kane, pulled him aside. "Mr. Ryan, I investigate missing children cases. I've seen dozens of situations where family members suspected abuse, but didn't act because they were afraid of being wrong, afraid of causing family drama. Your willingness to speak publicly about trusting your instincts is going to save lives. I wanted you to know that." Grant thanked her, humbled. He'd never intended to become a spokesman or advocate. He just wanted to protect his son and make sure the people responsible faced justice. But he was beginning to understand that his revenge against the Stevensons and their enablers had become something else, a mission to prevent others from suffering the same fate. Over the following months, Grant became more involved in child advocacy work. He consulted with law enforcement on how to approach parents who'd reported suspected abuse. He spoke at conferences and training sessions. He even helped draft new legislation in his state requiring mandatory reporting training for anyone who worked with children. Ethan, now 10, thrived. He'd fully recovered physically, and while the emotional scars would always be there, he'd learned to manage them with Dr. Herring's help. He'd become something of a local celebrity at his school. Kids knew his story and thought he was brave. He handled it with grace and humor that amazed Grant. "I'm not brave," Ethan told his father one night. "You're brave. You took me away from the bad people. I just survived. That's what brave is, buddy. Surviving when it's hard. Healing when it hurts. You're the bravest person I know." Wesley Stevenson died in prison 2 years into his sentence. A heart attack, sudden and final. Grant felt nothing when he heard. The man had been a monster, and monsters didn't deserve tears. Marlene was still alive, still incarcerated, still showing no remorse. Grant had heard from Agent Bridges that she'd tried to write letters to Ethan, claiming she'd only been disciplining him and that he'd misunderstood. The prison blocked them, but the attempt revealed how deeply broken she was, incapable of understanding the magnitude of her crimes. Grant sometimes wondered if his revenge had been enough. He'd exposed the enablers, forced accountability, helped change systems. But Marlene would die in prison without ever truly understanding why she'd been wrong. Some people, he'd learned, were incapable of redemption. But that didn't mean Grant's actions hadn't mattered. The 3 children saved by Donna Chen's vigilance after Grant confronted her. They were alive because he'd refused to let sleeping dogs lie. The cases reopened by his research, the families getting closure, the policies changed to prevent future Marlenis. All of it stemmed from his decision that night to drive his son to safety and then not stop fighting until every last secret was exposed. 5 years after that night, Grant stood in a cemetery with Ethan, now 12 and tall for his age. They were visiting graves. Maya Shepard's family had finally been able to bury her properly, and Grant had helped organize the memorial service. Dozens of people came, family, friends, investigators who'd worked her cold case, other families of victims. Grant and Ethan laid flowers on 8 graves that day. Maya, Timothy, Clara, David, Sophie, Michael, Angela, and Emma. 8 children who deserved so much better. Do you think they know? Ethan asked quietly. That you helped find them? That someone finally cared what happened? I hope so, Grant said. I like to think they do. As they walked back to the car, Ethan took his father's hand, something he'd stopped doing a few years ago, claiming he was too old. But today, in this place of endings and remembrance, he needed the connection. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. Why did Grandma Marlene do it? Dr. Herring says some people are broken inside, but I don't understand. How can someone be that broken? Grant had wrestled with this question for years. He'd read everything he could about criminal psychology, about abuse cycles, about the nature of evil. But there was no satisfying answer. I think, he said slowly, that some people are born without the parts that make us human. The parts that feel empathy, that understand right and wrong beyond just getting caught or not getting caught. And I think when those people are also abused themselves, like Marlene was by her grandmother, it creates something monstrous. But you said abuse doesn't have to define you. That you can break cycles. You can, but you have to choose to. Marlene never chose healing. She chose to perpetuate what was done to her, to find power in hurting others because she couldn't find it in herself. That was her choice, Ethan, not an inevitability, a choice. They drove home in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun painting the sky orange and gold. Back at their house, Raymond was waiting with pizza and a new video game he wanted Ethan to try. As Grant watched his son laugh with his uncle, racing through digital worlds where heroes always won and justice always prevailed, he felt something settle in his chest. Not closure, exactly. Some wounds never fully closed. But peace, perhaps. The knowledge that he'd done everything possible to right the wrongs, to prevent future harm, to transform his anger into action. His phone buzzed. A text from Olivia Kane, the FBI agent he'd met at the conference. Grant, thought you'd want to know. Because of her testimony at the child welfare reform hearings, Congress just passed the Ethan Ryan Child Protection Act. Mandatory reporting requirements just got teeth. This is going to save lives. Thank you. Grant stared at the message, stunned. He'd testified 6 months ago, sharing Ethan's story and advocating for stronger protections. But he'd never imagined his son's name would become law. He showed Ethan the message later that evening. His son read it twice, then looked up with tears in his eyes. They named a law after me, after what you survived, after your courage in telling the truth, even when it was scary. You helped make sure other kids have better protection than you did. Ethan hugged him fiercely. We did it together, Dad. You and me. We made something good come from something bad. And that, Grant realized, was the truest revenge of all. Not destruction or punishment, though those had their place, but transformation, taking the darkest moment of their lives and forging from it something that would protect countless children they'd never meet. The Stevensons were defeated not just by their imprisonment, but by their victims' refusal to let the story end in tragedy. Maya and the other children were finally remembered, finally honored. Ethan had survived and was thriving, and the system that had failed so many had been forced to change. Grant Ryan had started that night by making one simple choice: believe his son. Everything that followed, the investigation, the confrontations, the advocacy, the law, all stemmed from that single moment of a father choosing his child over convenience. It had cost him his marriage, his home, his old life. But it saved his son. And in doing so, it had saved others. As Grant tucked Ethan into bed that night, his son asked one more question. Do you ever regret it? Everything that happened. Grant thought of Alicia, serving 15 years in federal prison after her new trial. Of Marlene, rotting in a maximum security facility. Of Wesley, dead and unmourned. Of the life they might have had if he'd believed his wife that night instead of his son. Not for a second, he said. You were worth losing everything else for. Even Mom, especially Mom, because she showed me who she really was, and I chose who you really are instead. Best decision I ever made. Years later, when Ethan graduated high school with honors and a full scholarship to study social work, Grant sat in the audience watching his son give the valedictorian speech. Ethan talked about resilience, about the power of choosing courage over comfort, about how trauma could be transformed into purpose. He didn't mention the Stevensons by name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew his story. My father taught me that the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when it costs you everything, Ethan said, looking directly at Grant. He taught me that love means action, not just words. And he taught me that evil only wins when good people choose silence. The applause was deafening. Raymond leaned over and whispered, You did good, brother. You raised a hell of a kid. Grant nodded, too emotional to speak. His son, scarred but not broken, traumatized but not defeated, was about to go into the world and make it better. Was going to protect children who needed someone in their corner, just as Grant had been in his. That was the ultimate revenge against the Stevensons and everyone like them. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just escaping, but transforming. Not just justice, but prevention. Grant Ryan had started with one burning question that night 5 years ago. Who would hurt a child like this? He'd found the answer. And then he'd made sure the world knew it. That consequences followed. That change was forced into being. The Stevensons were gone. Dead or imprisoned for life. But the children they'd tried to destroy? 8 of them were finally at rest, honored and remembered. And the one who'd survived was standing on that stage, strong and whole, ready to make sure no other child suffered as he had. That was victory. Real, earned, absolute victory. And Grant Ryan, the father who'd chosen to believe his son over the comfortable lie, could finally rest. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Subscribe to Infidelity Tales Lab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Machine. The fluorescent lights of the 53rd floor hummed their midnight song as Reed Whitaker pushed the industrial mop across marble that once reflected his own ambition back at him. At 45, his hands that had coded revolutionary algorithms and signed million-dollar contracts, now wrung dirty water into a yellow bucket. The building was called Apex Tower. Ironic, considering how far he'd fallen. Reed paused at the glass wall overlooking downtown Seattle, his reflection a specter against the glittering cityscape. 7 years ago, he'd stood in this exact spot wearing a Tom Ford suit, celebrating Sentinel AI Series B funding. $23 million. The tech world had called him a visionary. Forbes had run a profile titled The Algorithm Whisperer. Now he wore a navy jumpsuit with maintenance embroidered over the breast pocket. His phone buzzed, a prepaid flip model, all he could afford. A text from his landlord about overdue rent. Reed deleted it without responding and returned to mopping, his movements mechanical, his mind elsewhere. 6 years earlier, Reed had met Corey Rollins at MIT, 2 computer science prodigies who complemented each other perfectly. Reed was the architect, the dreamer who saw patterns in chaos. Corey was the closer, charismatic and sharp-toned, who could sell ice to Eskimos. They'd become brothers in every way that mattered. Sentinel AI was Reed's brainchild, adaptive security algorithms that learned and evolved, making them virtually unhackable. The technology was revolutionary, but it was Reed's base code, thousands of hours of work his doctoral thesis made manifest, that formed its beating heart. Megan Hutchinson had entered his life like sunlight through storm clouds. A brilliant IP attorney with auburn hair and a laugh that made him believe in second chances. Reed had been abandoned by his mother at 12, raised by his father Glenn, a maintenance worker who died of a heart attack when Reed was 25. He'd spent 2 decades building walls around his heart. Megan had scaled them effortlessly. The engagement ring had cost 3 months' salary. She'd said yes in Pike Place Market, tourists applauding around them. He should have seen the signs. The late nights Megan spent reviewing contracts with Corey. The way Corey's hand lingered too long on her shoulder during board meetings. The encrypted folders on their shared server that Reed wasn't supposed to notice. But Reed had been blind, drunk on success and love. The betrayal came swiftly. Corey had convinced Reed to sign revised operating agreements, standard formalities for the Series C round. Reed trusted him. That signature cost him everything. Corey had been embedding backdoors in the code for months, creating parallel versions that he controlled. When the Series C closed, $47 million, Corey struck. He called an emergency board meeting, presenting evidence that Reed had been selling company secrets to competitors. Fabricated emails, doctored bank statements, falsified meetings. The board, stocked with Corey's business school connections, voted unanimously to remove Reed as CTO and revoke his equity. The lawsuit Reed filed was crushed by Megan's firm. She'd known every detail of his legal strategy. She'd helped him develop it. Every move he made, they anticipated. Every argument he raised, they demolished. The final blow came when Megan filed for dissolution of their engagement, citing Reed's fraudulent misrepresentation of his character. The public spectacle destroyed what little reputation he had left. 6 months later, Corey and Megan married in a ceremony featured in TechCrunch. Sentinel AI went public 18 months after that. Current valuation, $1.2 billion. Present day, Reed moved to the executive floor, his floor where Corey now held court. Through the glass walls, he could see the corner office that had been his. Photos of Corey and Megan in Aspen at galas, on yachts. Awards Reed's algorithms had won, now bearing Corey's name. The cleaning company Reed worked for, Premier Services, had a certain poetry to it. They'd won the Apex Tower contract from the firm Reed had originally hired. He'd requested this building specifically. His therapist, when he could still afford one, had called it masochistic. Reed called it staying close to the target. Because Reed Whitaker hadn't spent 6 years mopping floors and accepting defeat. He'd spent 6 years watching, learning, waiting. Every night, he cleaned offices and memorized passwords foolishly written on sticky notes. He studied their routines, their relationships, their weaknesses. He knew Corey had a gambling problem, poker games in private clubs where he regularly lost 6 figures. He knew Megan was paranoid about aging, spending thousands on treatments. He knew their marriage was a business arrangement held together by greed and mutual dependence. He knew everything, but knowledge wasn't power. Not without resources, not without capital. Reed had nothing. His father had left him nothing but memories of a good man ground down by the system. Or so he'd thought. Chapter 2. The Inheritance. Otis Warren was 83 years old and had worked at Apex Tower since it was called Pacific Financial Center. His hands trembled from Parkinson's, but his mind remained sharp as steel. He'd seen countless young men in suits chase their fortunes up these elevators. Most failed. Some succeeded. Very few understood what mattered. He'd been watching Reed Whitaker for 3 months now. Most janitors accepted their lot, going through the motions. Reed was different. Otis saw the intelligence behind his eyes, the careful way he observed everything. And Otis recognized the look of a man who'd lost something precious. He'd seen it in his own mirror after his wife Martha died. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when Otis found Reed sitting in the stairwell between the 49th and 50th floors. The younger man's shoulders shook with silent sobs, his face buried in his hands. Otis had seen this moment coming. "Your old man worked here, didn't he?" Otis's voice was gravel and honey. "Back in the 70s? Reed looked up, quickly wiping his eyes. "How did you?" "Glenn Whitaker. Good man. We worked together for 11 years before he left for that tech company." Otis eased himself onto the step with a grunt. You got his eyes. Same look he had, like you're solving equations in your head while the world talks at you. "He never mentioned working here," Reed said quietly. "Probably wanted to forget it." This building wasn't always so fancy. It used to be a manufacturing plant before they converted it. Otis pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket. Found this in a lost and found storage. Been there 30 years, maybe more. Was doing inventory, saw the name. Thought you might want it. The envelope was yellowed with age, the seal broken long ago. Reed's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were stock certificates. Physical paper ornately designed from a company called Pacific Semiconductor Solutions, dated 1979. Issued to Glenn Whitaker. 5,000 shares. I don't understand, Reed whispered. My father never mentioned owning stock. Different times back then, Otis said. Companies gave shares to employees before all this digital nonsense. Most people lost track of them. He stood slowly. Might be nothing. Might be something. Worth checking. Otis left Reed alone with the certificates. Reed's apartment was a studio in Ballard, 400 square feet of regulated poverty. The building smelled like boiled cabbage and broken dreams. But it had internet. He booted up his ancient laptop, a machine he'd salvaged from e-waste, and searched for Pacific Semiconductor Solutions. The first result stopped his heart. Pacific Semiconductor Solutions acquired by Volt-Tech Industries, 1983. He clicked deeper. Volt-Tech had merged with Cyberdynamics in 1991. Cyberdynamics had been purchased by Global Tech Consortium in 2004. Global Tech had restructured, spinning off its semiconductor division into what was now called Helix Microsystems. Helix Microsystems. Current market cap, $47 billion. Reed's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing databases he'd built back doors into years ago, habits from his seminal days. He traced the stock splits, the mergers, the acquisitions. 5,000 shares of Pacific Semiconductor in 1979, adjusted for splits and conversions, would now be equivalent to 240,000 shares of Helix Microsystems. Current stock price, $287.34 per share. Reed did the math 3 times, certain he'd made an error. $68,961,600. $69 million. His father, a man who died with $17,000 in credit card debt, who'd worked 60-hour weeks and never taken a vacation, had been sitting on a fortune he never knew existed. Reed sat in the darkness of his apartment, the certificate in his hands, and laughed. It started as a chuckle, then grew into something wild and broken, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of joy, tears of rage. His father had died believing he'd failed, believing he'd left his son nothing. Had died working himself into an early grave while a piece of paper gathering dust in a lost and found box represented generational wealth. The universe had a sick sense of humor. But fortune favors the prepared, and Reed Whitaker had spent 6 years preparing for exactly this moment. He opened a new browser tab and began a plan. Chapter 3. The Architect Returns. Converting decades-old stock certificates into liquid capital required lawyers, the expensive kind. Reed spent 3 days researching before settling on the firm of Leonard & Associates, specifically targeting Barry Leonard, a 62-year-old securities attorney who'd built his reputation recovering lost assets for estates. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon. Reed arrived wearing a thrift store suit he'd tailored himself, carrying a briefcase that had cost more than his monthly rent. Appearances mattered. Barry Leonard's office occupied the 34th floor of Columbia Tower, all dark wood and leather-bound law books that nobody actually read anymore. Barry himself was silver-haired and sharp-eyed, studying Reed over steepled fingers. Mr. Whitaker, your situation is unusual. I'm aware. These certificates are legitimate. I've verified the documentation. However, claiming them will require probate proceedings, verification of identity, and potentially challenging any statute of limitations issues. Barry leaned back. It could take 6 to 8 months. Legal fees will run approximately $150,000. How much can you advance me? Barry raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? You know these shares are legitimate. You know they're worth nearly $70 million. I need working capital now. Reed met his gaze steadily. Loan me $2 million against the shares. When they're liquidated, you get $3 million plus your standard fees. That's highly irregular. That's $1 million profit for 6 months of paperwork. Reed smiled thinly. I did my homework, Mr. Leonard. You're 3 months from retirement, looking for one last big score. Your daughter's medical bills from her cancer treatment nearly bankrupted you. This is easy money. Barry's expression hardened, then slowly transformed into respect. You're not just some lucky janitor, are you? No, Reed said. I'm not. They shook hands. The money hit Reed's new account, established under a shell corporation, 10 days later. $2 million. A fraction of what was coming, but enough to begin. Reed's first purchase was information. He hired Eduardo Fowler, a private investigator who'd gone to prison for hacking, which made him perfect for Reed's needs. Eduardo was 42, lean and hungry, with a past that made him unafraid of crossing lines. I need everything on Corey Rollins and Megan Rollins, née Hutchinson, Reed said at their first meeting held in a downtown coffee shop. He slid a folder across the table. Financial records, communications, business dealings, personal relationships. Everything. Eduardo thumbed through the initial research Reed had compiled. You've already got a lot here. What's this really about? Revenge. Eduardo grinned. My favorite project type. Double my usual rate, and I'm in. Done. While Eduardo worked, Reed began his transformation. He quit Premier Services, citing a family emergency. His manager barely noticed. Janitors were invisible. Reed moved into a furnished executive apartment in Belltown under the name Lawrence Glenn, a nod to his father. He bought clothes that fit, got a decent haircut, joined an upscale gym. Not to erase who he'd been, but to become who he needed to be. He spent 12 hours a day in his home office, which he'd converted into a war room. One wall displayed photographs of Corey and Megan, their associates, their properties, their routines. Another wall tracked Sentinel AI's corporate structure, shareholders, board members. Eduardo delivered his first report after 3 weeks. Your boy Corey has expensive tastes, Eduardo said, spreading documents across Reed's dining table. He's in underground poker games run by a guy named Joey Figueroa. High stakes, no cameras, invitation only. Corey's down about $4.3 million over the past 2 years. Can he cover it? Barely. He's been selling stock options, taking personal loans. But here's the interesting part. 3 months ago, he started winning. Reed leaned forward. Consistently, too consistently. I tracked the games through some contacts. Same dealer, same players. Corey's suddenly on a hot streak that defies probability. Eduardo pulled up a spreadsheet. I think the game's being rigged in his favor. Why? Leverage. Figueroa's connected to the Maldonado family. They're venture capitalists with very flexible definitions of investment. Reed absorbed this. Organized crime infiltrating tech. It made sense. The industry moved too much money not to attract wolves. And Megan. Eduardo's expression darkened. She's got secrets too. Been having an affair for 8 months with her senior partner, Max Whitaker. Reed blinked. Whitaker? No relation? I checked. But yeah, ironic. Eduardo pulled out surveillance photos. They're careful, but not careful enough. Hotel meetings billed as client consultations. Burner phones. The whole cliché. Does Corey know? If he does, he doesn't care. I think they have an arrangement. Marriage of convenience. She gets social status and half his assets. He gets her legal protection and respectability. Reed studied the photographs. Megan looked different from the woman he'd known. Harder, colder, with the brittle perfection of Botox and designer clothes. Had she always been this person, or had success transformed her? Did it matter? I need more, Reed said. I need to know every deal Sentinel AI has pending, every vulnerability in their business model, every skeleton in every closet. Eduardo nodded. This is going to cost more than $2 million. I know. Reed met his eyes. I'm liquidating the full stock position. $70 million, minus legal fees. Whatever it takes. Jesus. Eduardo whistled low. What exactly are you planning? Reed smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. I'm going to give them everything they deserve. Barry Leonard called 6 weeks after their initial meeting. The shares have cleared probate. We can begin liquidating. Do it. Sell everything. Mr. Whitaker, I'd advise a more gradual approach. Dumping 240,000 shares at once will. I don't care about maximizing value. I need liquidity. Sell. The sale took 3 days. After legal fees, taxes, and Barry's premium, Reed netted $61 million for $100,000. He'd grown up wearing secondhand clothes and eating ramen. His father had died with nothing. Now Reed Whitaker commanded more wealth than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. He felt nothing but cold fury. That evening, Reed stood in his apartment, no longer a janitor's studio, but still modest by choice, and looked at the wall of evidence. He'd spent 6 years in hell. Corey and Megan had spent 6 years in heaven. The scales were about to balance. He picked up his phone and called Eduardo. Set up a meeting with Joey Figueroa. Tell him I'm a high-net-worth individual interested in exclusive investment opportunities. Reed, these aren't people you play with. Set up the meeting. A pause. You're going to war. I've been at war, Reed said quietly. I'm just finally armed. Chapter 4. Into the belly. Joey Figueroa ran his operations from a legitimate front. The Meridian Club, an exclusive poker lounge in Pioneer Square. Members only, strictly enforced. The kind of place where tech money met old money that preferred not to discuss its origins. Reed arrived on a Thursday night wearing a $6,000 suit and carrying $60,000 in cash. Enough to look serious, not enough to threaten. Eduardo had arranged his introduction through a cryptocurrency investor. Reed had paid $30,000 to vouch for him as Lawrence Glenn, private equity. The club's interior was all dark wood and leather, the air thick with cigar smoke and expensive cologne. Poker tables filled the main floor, but the real action happened in the private rooms upstairs. Joey Figueroa was waiting in room 7. He was 52, compact and muscular, with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. 2 men flanked him, Muscle trying to look casual. Mr. Glenn. Joey's handshake was firm, territorial. Eduardo speaks highly of you. Says you're looking for opportunities. I am. Reed settled into the leather chair, projecting calm confidence. I've had success in tech, looking to diversify. I understand you facilitate certain alternative investments. I connect people who have capital with people who need capital. Sometimes those connections happen around a poker table. Joey poured bourbon into crystal glasses. Why should I trust you? Because I have money and you have access. We both benefit from the relationship. Reed sipped the bourbon, expensive smooth. I also understand you have a relationship with Corey Rollins of Sentinel AI. Joey's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. You know Corey? Of him. Impressive company. Revolutionary technology. Reed leaned back. I'm interested in getting into their next funding round. Private placement before they announce publicly. That information isn't public. I know. That's why I'm talking to you. Joey studied him for a long moment. What makes you think I have insider information about Sentinel's funding? Because Corey owes you money, and you've been letting him win at poker to keep him loyal. Reed smiled, which means you're positioned to benefit from his success. I want it on whatever arrangement you have. The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. Joey's men moved slightly, hands drifting toward concealed weapons. Then Joey laughed, a genuine sound of appreciation. Eduardo undersold you. You've got balls, Mr. Glenn. I've got money and I understand leverage. Same as you. Corey's planning a major acquisition, Joey said slowly. Defense contract worth $400 million. Stock will triple when it's announced. He's been feeding me information in exchange for favorable loan terms. I want in. $5 million for details on the timeline and terms. Another $10 million invested through your channels, so it doesn't trace back to me. Joey's smile widened. You're either very smart or very stupid. Which is it? Smart enough to know that making you richer makes me more valuable alive than dead. They shook hands again, and Reed felt the first piece of his plan click into place. Chapter 5. The Trojan Horse. With Joey's cooperation secured, Reed had his entry point. But infiltration required more than money. It required access and credibility. He established Lawrence Glenn Ventures, a legitimate investment firm with a slick website, rented office space in Apex Tower, 3 floors below Sentinel AI, and hired a small staff who believed they were working for a successful tech investor. His head of operations was Deanna Doyle, a former Wall Street analyst who'd been blacklisted after whistleblowing on her firm's illegal practices. She was 41, brilliant, and had an axe to grind against corporate corruption. "What's our actual strategy?" Deanna asked during their first private meeting. She'd figured out quickly that Lawrence Glenn Ventures was a front. "We're going to destroy Sentinel AI from the inside," Reed said simply. "You have a problem with that?" "Depends. Are they criminals?" Reed told her everything. The stolen code, the fabricated evidence, the betrayal. He showed her documentation, original code repositories, communications he'd secretly preserved. Deanna's expression hardened. "I'm in. What do you need?" "I need us positioned as Sentinel's next major investor. We'll use Joey's information about the defense contract to get a meeting. Once we're inside, we find their vulnerabilities." Eduardo's continued surveillance revealed a critical piece of information. Sentinel AI was built on shaky ground. Corey had been aggressively acquiring smaller AI companies to pad Sentinel's patent portfolio and technology stack. But in his haste, he'd been sloppy. Several of the acquisitions involved technology with murky ownership, including source code that potentially violated open-source licenses. More importantly, the core algorithms, Reed's original code, had been modified by a team of developers who'd introduced subtle bugs and security vulnerabilities. Sentinel appeared revolutionary, but was actually a house of cards, held together by aggressive marketing and Corey's charisma. The defense contract Joey mentioned was with the Department of Defense, a 5-year deal to provide AI-driven cybersecurity for military networks. It was Sentinel's biggest play, the deal that would cement their dominance. It was also illegal if the underlying technology infringed on other patents or contained security flaws. Reed smiled when Eduardo laid out the evidence. "This is perfect." "Perfect how?" "This destroys the company." "Exactly." Reed's first meeting with Corey Rollins in 6 years happened on a rainy October afternoon. Lawrence Glenn Ventures had expressed interest in investing $20 million in Sentinel's Series D round. Corey, always eager for more capital, agreed to the meeting personally. Reed had prepared for this moment meticulously. He'd changed more than his appearance. He'd changed his mannerisms, his voice modulation, his body language. He wore blue-tinted contact lenses and lifts in his shoes. He'd adopted a faint Boston accent, remnants of time at Harvard Business School. When he walked into Sentinel's conference room, Corey didn't recognize him. "Mr. Glenn, pleasure to meet you." Corey's handshake was firm, his smile practiced. He'd gained weight, wore his success like expensive cologne. "I've heard impressive things about your firm." "We do our homework," Reed said smoothly. "Sentinel's technology is remarkable. Revolutionary, even." Megan was there too, sitting at Corey's right hand. She'd aged well, her beauty now calculated and maintained. She looked at Reed with the polite disinterest of someone who met too many investors to remember faces. Reed felt nothing. The woman he'd loved was long dead. "Walk me through the core technology," Reed said. "I want to understand what makes Sentinel different." Corey launched into his pitch, the same pitch Reed had written 7 years ago, now delivered by the man who'd stolen it. Reed listened, nodded at the right moments, asked intelligent questions. "Impressive," Reed said when Corey finished. "My concern is scalability. Can your algorithms handle the Pentagon contract you're pursuing?" Corey's smile flickered. "That's confidential information. It's also leaked all over defense contractor circles. I have sources." Reed leaned forward. "I'm not concerned about the contract itself. I'm concerned about whether your infrastructure can handle it. $20 million is a lot to invest if the technology can't scale." "Our technology is battle-tested," Megan interjected. "We've been running enterprise clients for 3 years without major incidents." Enterprise clients aren't the Pentagon. One breach, one failure, and you're facing congressional hearings. Reed smiled. "I'd like my team to conduct a technical audit before we commit capital. Standard due diligence." Corey and Megan exchanged glances, a married couple's silent communication. "That's unusual," Corey said carefully. "So, is $20 million. Reed stood, extending his hand. Think about it. I'm patient. Chapter 6. The cracks appear. Corey agreed to the audit with restrictions. Reed's team, actually cybersecurity experts Eduardo hired, would have limited access to non-critical systems, supervised by a Sentinel's own security team. It was enough. Reed's experts were looking for specific vulnerabilities he'd hypothesized based on his knowledge of the original code architecture. They found them within 3 days. Jesus Christ, said Sang Huffman, the lead penetration tester. This is amateur hour. They've got hard-coded credentials, unpatched libraries dating back 5 years, and their encryption implementation is so weak I cracked it with a laptop. Can you prove the core algorithm was stolen? Reed asked. Sang pulled up code on his screen, highlighting specific functions. See this? This is derivative of open-source military-grade encryption, which is fine, except they modified it without attribution, which violates the GPL license. If the DoD finds out their security system is based on a legally modified open-source code, they'll terminate the contract and potentially sue for fraud. Exactly. Reed had what he needed, but one piece was still missing. He needed someone inside Sentinel to act as a witness, someone credible who could testify to the code theft and corporate malfeasance. The answer came from an unexpected source. Trenton Jackson had been Reed's junior developer at Sentinel, a 26-year-old prodigy when Reed hired him. Now 32, Trenton was Sentinel's lead engineer, the guy actually keeping Corey's stolen code functional. Eduardo discovered that Trenton was deeply unhappy. Corey regularly took credit for Trenton's work, underpaid him relative to his value, and had recently passed him over for promotion in favor of a less qualified candidate who was Corey's business school friend. Reed arranged a chance encounter at Trenton's regular lunch spot, a faux restaurant in the International District. Trenton Jackson? Reed approached his table. Lawrence Glenn, I've heard great things about your work at Sentinel. Trenton looked up, suspicious but curious. Do I know you? Not yet, but I'm considering investing heavily in Sentinel, and I always research the people behind the technology. Reed smiled. Mind if I sit? Over lunch, Reed carefully probed Trenton's frustrations. The younger man was desperate to vent about Corey's incompetence, the shaky code base, the credit theft, the toxic culture. Can I tell you something in confidence? Reed leaned forward. I think Sentinel is a fraud. I think the core technology was stolen, and I think Corey Rollins is riding someone else's genius. Trenton's expression shifted, shock, then recognition. How did you? Because I've seen it before. I've seen brilliant engineers get crushed by charismatic businessmen who steal their work. Reed held his gaze. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? I sign NDAs, non-competes. If I leave, Corey will bury me in lawsuits. What if you had protection? What if you had someone with resources willing to back you, expose the truth, and make sure Corey faces consequences? Trenton studied him for a long moment. Who are you really? Someone who cares about justice. Reed slid a card across the table. Think about it. When you're ready to do the right thing, call me. 3 days later, Trenton called. They met in Reed's office after hours. Reed laid out everything. The stolen code, the fabricated evidence, the betrayal. He showed Trenton his original documentation. The smoking gun that proved Sentinel's core algorithm was Reed's creation. I knew it, Trenton said, shaking his head. I always knew. The architecture, the elegance, it never fit with Corey's sloppy style. But I couldn't prove it. Now you can. I need you to document everything. Every instance of code theft, every vulnerability, every lie Corey's told to investors. I need internal communications, board meeting minutes, technical documentation. That's corporate espionage. That's whistleblowing. There's a difference. Reed leaned forward. Corey is about to sign a $400 million defense contract with faulty technology. When it fails, and people could die. Military networks compromised, classified information stolen. Are you willing to let that happen? Trenton's jaw tightened. What do I get out of this? Protection, a new job with my firm at twice your current salary, and the satisfaction of watching Corey Rollins burn. They shook hands. Chapter 7. The House of Cards. Trenton's intelligence was devastating. Over 3 weeks, he compiled internal documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Corey had knowingly misrepresented Sentinel's capabilities to investors, hidden security vulnerabilities from the board, and falsified technical reports submitted to the Department of Defense. But Reed wasn't ready to strike yet. He needed perfect timing. He continued playing Lawrence Glenn, the eager investor. He attended Sentinel's board meetings as an observer, smiled at Corey's jokes, nodded at Megan's legal presentations. He watched them relax, convinced they'd hooked another wealthy fool. Meanwhile, Joey Figueroa grew impatient. When's this defense contract closing? Joey demanded during a meeting at the Meridian Club. I've got $15 million invested through back channels on your tip. I need that stock spike. Soon, Reed assured him. Corey's finalizing details with the Pentagon. Another month, maybe 2. It better be. Bruno Maldonado doesn't like waiting, and I don't like disappointing Bruno. Reed smiled internally. The Maldonado family's investment created another vulnerability. Organized crime money tied to Sentinel's success. When the company collapsed, it would take Joey and his bosses down too. Perfect. The trigger came from an unexpected source, Megan. Eduardo's surveillance caught her meeting with Max Whitaker at the Four Seasons. But this time, their conversation wasn't romantic, it was panicked. Eduardo had planted listening devices in Max's briefcase during a chance collision at a coffee shop. The recording was damning. Corey's going to destroy us. Megan's voice, tight with stress. The Pentagon audit is in 2 weeks. If they find the security flaws. They won't. Max said, we've got the reports sanitized. But the code itself, Max, I've seen the internal reviews. We're not ready. If this fails, every investor will sue. I could lose my bar license. Then we need leverage. Something to protect us if Corey goes down. I've been documenting everything. His decisions, his orders, his lies. If this explodes, I'm making sure he takes the fall, not me. Reed listened to the recording 3 times. Megan was preparing to betray Corey, the same way she'd betrayed Reed. Loyalty, he reflected, was never her strength. He could use this. Reed arranged a private meeting with Megan under the pretense of discussing Lawrence Glenn Ventures' investment timeline. She agreed, suggesting her law firm's conference room. She arrived perfectly composed, tailored suit, practiced smile, a woman in complete control. Reed shattered that control with 4 words, hello, Megan. Remember me? Her face went white. The carefully constructed mask cracked, revealing genuine shock underneath. He'd removed the contact lenses, let his natural voice emerge. The conference room suddenly felt very small. You look good, Reed said conversationally. Marriage to my former company agrees with you. She struggled, then found her lawyer's composure. Lawrence Glenn is you. Surprise. What do you want? Her voice turned hard. Revenge? To gloat. Information. Reed slid a folder across the table. I know you're preparing to turn on Corey. I know about your documentation, your contingency plans. I know about Max. Megan's hands shook as she opened the folder. Photos, recordings, documents detailing her affair and her intentions to escape Sentinel's impending disaster. Here's what's going to happen, Reed continued. The Pentagon audit will discover that Sentinel's technology is compromised. The defense contract will collapse. The stock will crater. And Corey will face criminal charges for fraud. You can't prove. I have the original code. Megan, I have documentation proving Corey stole my work. I have internal witnesses ready to testify. I have everything. She stared at him, processing. What do you want from me? Your testimony. You're going to tell the truth about how you helped Corey frame me, how you fabricated evidence, how you participated in the theft. You're going to give a deposition to my attorneys, and you're going to cooperate with federal investigators. That'll destroy my career. That'll save your freedom. Because when this ends, Corey's going to prison. And everyone who helped him will face charges, unless they cooperate. Reed leaned forward. You taught me how the legal system works. Cooperate early, minimize your exposure. First one through the door gets the best deal. Megan was silent for a long moment. Finally, Max was right. You're the dangerous one, not Corey. We never should have. Betrayed me? Stolen my life's work? destroyed my reputation. Reed's voice was ice. No, you shouldn't have. But you did. Now you pay. If I cooperate, what happens to me? You lose your law license temporarily, but avoid prison. You divorce Corey, forfeit your shares in Sentinel, and start over. He stood. Or you protect Corey and spend the next 10 years in federal prison. Your choice. He left her sitting there, the folder open in front of her, her perfect world crumbling. Chapter 8. The Dominoes Fall. The Pentagon audit began on a cold November morning. Reed had ensured that the auditors assigned to Sentinel were the most thorough, most paranoid officers the Department of Defense employed. He'd also anonymously tipped them to specific security concerns through a whistleblower website. They found the vulnerabilities immediately. By day 3, Sentinel was in crisis mode. Corey called emergency meetings, screamed at engineers, demanded answers. Trenton, still playing his role as a loyal employee, fed Reed real-time updates on the chaos. The audit report was brutal. Sentinel AI's cybersecurity platform contains multiple critical vulnerabilities, including hard-coded credentials, unpatched security flaws, and encryption implementations that fail to meet DoD security standards. Furthermore, significant portions of the codebase appear to be derivative works that may violate intellectual property rights. Recommendation: immediate termination of contract negotiations. The Pentagon withdrew their offer that same day. Sentinel's stock price dropped 18% in after-hours trading. Emergency board meetings were called. Investors demanded explanations. Corey blamed Trenton and his engineering team, firing 4 people on the spot. It was the opening Reed needed. 2 days after the Pentagon withdrawal, Reed held a press conference. Not as Lawrence Glenn, but as Reed Whitaker, using his real name for the first time in 6 years. Deanna had arranged everything. A legitimate PR firm, legal counsel, journalists from TechCrunch, Wire, the Wall Street Journal. The conference room in a downtown hotel was packed. Reed stood at the podium, calm and controlled, and told his story. He detailed how he'd created Sentinel's core algorithm, how Corey Rollins had systematically stolen his code, how Megan Hutchinson had used her position to frame him. He presented documentation, original code repositories with timestamps, emails, internal communications Trenton had provided. He showed side-by-side comparisons of his code and Sentinel's, highlighting the identical architecture, the same unusual optimization techniques, the same unique variable naming conventions. Corey Rollins built a billion-dollar company on stolen work, Reed said quietly. And when the Pentagon discovered the truth, that this revolutionary technology was actually stolen and proven and dangerously flawed, the whole house of cards collapsed. The journalists erupted with questions. Reed answered them all with technical precision and devastating clarity. By evening, the story was national news. #Sentinel Scandal trended on Twitter. Investors filed lawsuits. The SEC opened an investigation. Corey tried to respond with his own press conference, but he was incoherent, defensive, his charisma finally failing him. Megan stood beside him, her face a mask, saying nothing. That night, she called Reed. "I'll cooperate," she said simply. "I'll give you everything." Smart choice. Chapter 9. Ashes and Empire. The collapse was spectacular and absolute. Within 2 weeks, Sentinel AI filed for bankruptcy. The company that had been valued at $1.2 billion was liquidated for parts, acquired by competitors who wanted the client list and infrastructure, not the compromise code. Corey faced federal charges: wire fraud, securities fraud, theft of trade secrets, lying to federal officials. The evidence Reed provided, backed by Megan's testimony and Trenton's documentation, was overwhelming. Joey Figueroa tried to distance himself, but the Maldonado family's investment in Sentinel created a paper trail that federal investigators followed eagerly. Joey and 3 of his associates were indicted on money laundering and racketeering charges. Megan negotiated a plea deal. She'd lose her law license for 5 years and pay substantial fines, but avoided prison. She provided testimony against both Corey and her firm, which faced its own ethics investigation. Max Whitaker's career ended when his affair and role in the cover-up became public. Through it all, Reed remained calm, almost detached. Eduardo watched him carefully during the trials. "You're not celebrating," Eduardo observed. "You won." "I didn't win," Reed said quietly. "I survived. There's a difference." The trial lasted 4 months. Reed testified for 3 days, walking the jury through the theft, the betrayal, the systematic fraud. Trenton testified. Megan testified. The evidence was insurmountable. Corey Rollins was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Reed attended the sentencing. Corey looked diminished in his prison jumpsuit, his arrogance finally stripped away. When their eyes met across the courtroom, Reed felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just emptiness. Outside the courthouse, journalists swarmed him. "How does it feel to get justice?" one asked. Reed considered the question. Justice was a clean word for a messy process. He destroyed lives, ruined careers, crossed lines he'd once considered sacred. He'd become the kind of man his father, good, simple Glenn Whitaker, would barely recognize. But he'd survived. "It feels like closure," Reed said finally. 6 months after Corey's sentencing, Reed stood in the same spot where he'd once mopped floors, the 53rd floor of Apex Tower, looking out at Seattle's skyline. But now he wore a suit tailored on Seville Row, and this floor belonged to Whitaker Ventures, the company he'd built from Sentinel's ashes. He'd acquired several of Sentinel's patents in the bankruptcy auction, along with key staff who'd been Corey's victims. Trenton was his CTO. Deanna was his CFO. They were building something new, something clean, built on honest work and proper attribution. It would never be as big as Sentinel had been, but it would be real. Otis Warren visited on a Tuesday afternoon, shuffling off the elevator with a smile. "Thought I'd see how you turned out," Otis said, looking around the office. "Your father would be proud." "Would he?" Reed's voice was hollow. "I did terrible things, Otis. I destroyed people. You destroyed people who deserved destroying." Otis settled into a chair with a grunt. "Your daddy taught me something back in the 70s. He said the world doesn't give you what you deserve. It gives you what you take. Only question is whether you take it honestly or dishonestly. And which did I do? Both, probably." Otis smiled. "But you owned it. That's more than most people can say." After Otis left, Reed stood at the window as darkness fell over the city. Lights flickered on across downtown. Thousands of windows, thousands of lives, each one fighting their own battles. He thought about his father, dying with nothing, never knowing about the fortune gathering dust in a lost and found box. He thought about the man he'd been, brilliant but naive, trusting but blind. He thought about the man he'd become. His phone buzzed. A message from his therapist. Yes, he could afford one now, reminding him about tomorrow's appointment. He was working through it, slowly, the anger and betrayal and grief. Healing wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, one day at a time. Reed Whitaker had lost everything and climbed back from nothing. He'd been broken and rebuilt himself stronger. He'd faced his demons and won. The cost had been high, but standing here, in his own company, built on his own terms, he understood